de-escalation.
Okay, let's bring in CNN senior White House correspondent Phil Mattingly, CNN's Kylie Atwood at the State Department, and senior international correspondent Matthew Chance. We also have with us former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, and Jill Dougherty, CNN's former Moscow bureau chief and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Okay, Jill, let me start with you. What were the big headlines to you?
You know, I think the big headline is today, right now, it does not look as if there will be an invasion. However, obviously, the United States and the allies in Europe are on alert. But I would point out one thing that really, if Vladimir Putin were listening to that conference, and his people certainly are, I would point out that Vladimir Putin goes into that wanting wider talks about the future of European security. And that really definitely involves the future of Ukraine. And if you listen to what Jake Sullivan said, he said, we can address larger strategic concerns if provided we are operating in a climate of de-escalation. So I think what the White House really did, what Biden did, was to say, okay, we hear you, we see your troops, we know you're serious about this, and we're willing to talk about the things that really, bother you, but you can't invade. And if you do, we are ready. And Nord Stream, we'll get into energy, but energy is crucial. And that quote, if he wants gas to flow through Nord Stream 2, he better not take any action. So those would be the headlines to me.
Let's go to Matthew Chance, who is with the Kremlin's response. We just listened for about 20 minutes from the White House's readout of the call. How's the Kremlin describing this call between the presidents?
I mean, they're not characterizing the nature of the discussions, but they've issued a longish sort of readout, a text readout of how it went and the sort of subjects that were discussed. There hasn't been a briefing yet, like you've just heard from Jake Sullivan. There's going to be one of those pretty soon. They started off the readout talking about recalling the alliance that was enjoyed between the United States and the then Soviet Union back in the Second World War, suggesting that it's that sort of format of a relationship, that kind of alliance that should be used to tackle the problems of the current day. The readout, unsurprisingly, from the Kremlin gives a lot more emphasis to the situation in Ukraine, in the sense that it mentions that the United States president talked about the alleged build-up, as they would characterize it, of Russian forces threatening the sovereignty of Ukraine, and talked about the idea there could be sanctions imposed against Russia if Russia were to give an order to violate the territorial integrity again of Ukraine. But the real emphasis of the readout was that Vladimir Putin putting across what his demands are, the idea that he wants legal guarantees for NATO, the Western military alliance, not to expand any further eastward, and more for NATO to stop deploying military infrastructure to the ground in Ukraine, but essentially making it I'm paraphrasing now, essentially making it a forward operating base for NATO countries. He wants that stopped. He wants a legal framework in place so that there's an actual treaty there to prevent Ukraine ever joining the NATO military alliance. And there was no characterization in the readout about how that was received on the US side. It's just that the two sides, the two presidents, agreed to sort of delegate that to their teams, and it's something that will be discussed in an ongoing way. But as we reported before, it's very unlikely that the United States or its allies are going to agree to consulting Russia when it comes to who and who is not part of the Western military alliance.
Ambassador, tell us how you see NATO playing into this. What's their role now that we've heard both sides?
Well, I think what was interesting was that both in the readout from the White House and in what Jake Sullivan said, the emphasis was not on the United States acting alone, either in terms of the measures, economic and other measures that they would take in case of an invasion, or in terms of the diplomacy that was being offered, but it would do it together with its allies. And I think it's very important to underscore that the administration has spent a lot of time to get the allies to be unified on both of those possible avenues. The avenue that says if you do, in fact, invade further in Ukraine, there will be strong economic and other measures, and those other measures include more military capabilities, both streaming into Ukraine itself, as well as to reinforce the commitment that the United States and other NATO members have made to the defense of the countries, the NATO countries in Eastern Europe, and also to do that together with our allies. And at the same time to say, but you know, if you actually de-escalate, if you start to reduce your forces, we're interested in a diplomatic engagement, both in order to find a way out of the situation in Ukraine, and if you want, a larger discussion about the future of European security. I don't think that is a concession to Russia. It is only a recognition that these are issues that are better dealt with in diplomacy than they are through the force of arms. It's something that the allies have long put on the table, that they're more than willing to talk about European security issues with Russia. They're just not willing to limit the independence and sovereignty of countries in Europe. Just because Russia demands that, as it is, in fact, asking with regard to Ukraine and these legal guarantees that Matthew was just talking about. Those are not going to be on the table. The allies are clear on that. The United States was clear on that. And the choice really now is Moscow. It can either engage in diplomacy or it can see the kind of measures that President Biden laid out in the conversation.
And let's talk about those, Phil. Jake Sullivan said the things that the U.S. was not prepared to do in 2014, it is prepared to do now. And we know from reporting is that it was then Vice President Biden who was pushing President Obama to supply those anti-tank missiles, to give more lethal options to Ukraine. President Obama rejected that. It looks like, although they did not say it explicitly, that that could be part of the package that's going to Ukraine if there is a move across that border.
Well, I think it's already been part of a package that the Biden administration has put together in terms of defense capability and assistance that's been sent to Ukraine over the course of the last year. That's something that they've focused on. They've gone further than the Obama administration did at the time. And as you noted, Vice President Biden was one of those inside the administration who wanted to go further. His administration has done that in terms of the weapons side of things. I think the interesting element that Jake also said is they're willing to go further than 2014 on the sanctions side as well. And we've been talking, guys, about what the U.S. is considering on the sanctions side for the last 24 hours or so in terms of sanctions related to the energy sector, the financial system, some of those in the inner circle of President Putin. The key element here, and the ambassador got at this, is that the U.S. can't necessarily operate unilaterally on that front. That has to be done in coordination with allies to have actual tangible bite. And I think that's what the president has been working on over the course of the last several weeks, and his team is trying to ensure that European allies who have very different equities, very different interests when it comes to Russia, particularly on the energy side, are lined up together. There was a call yesterday with key European allies. The president is expected to talk, I think, right about now, maybe a little bit earlier than now, with those key leaders once again to go through what he discussed with Russian President Vladimir Putin, trying to make clear both inside the alliances but also to the Russians that it's not just the United States having a position, it's not just one or two countries having the position. European allies and the U.S. are aligned together to make this point that yes, diplomacy should be the option. They are willing to have discussions about the future here, but they are also willing to be aligned together and unified together in whatever course of action they would take on the sanction side of things if Russia continues to pursue the path that they've been on. I think that was a critical point the president wanted to make today, and that's a critical point that he and his team have been making over the course of the last several days and will continue to in the days ahead. It's not just the U.S. here, it's their general alliance with the European leaders, and they will be moving together in terms of whatever happens next, either diplomatically or in terms of sanctions and other things that may bite.
Let's talk about that, Kylie. What is next from the State Department's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the State Department, as National Security Advisor said, there has been intimately involved in drawing up these sanctions options with the NSC, with the Treasury Department, looking at a whole host of options, as Biden administration officials have been saying. things that the United States hasn't done in the past to economically impinge on Russia. The key here, however, is that they do want to act, as Phil was saying, alongside allies. So it's figuring out what the options are here that the United States has at its disposal that allies will do alongside them. Two significant things that the National Security Advisor said there is that he's not willing to publicly detail what those economic sanctions are going to look like, but he said that the Biden administration has told the Russians in some detail what that would look like. So it's not like Russia's playing a guessing game here. The Biden administration has been telling them behind the scenes, listen, this is a situation you're going to face if you invade Ukraine. The other important thing that the National Security Advisor said is that both of the presidents, not just President Biden, but President Putin as well, they tasked their teams with following up on their conversation. And, you know, that's a little bit of diplo speak here, but what that indicates is that they didn't face a dead end. There are going to be follow-up conversations from this presidential level conversation, which indicates that there is some forward movement here. This wasn't a conversation that essentially didn't go anywhere at all. So that is an area that we'll be watching for. Will the State Department be following up on that? Will the National Security Council be following up on that? Where do things go from here? Those follow-up conversations will determine that.
Jill, 100,000 Russian forces on the border now, estimates that could go up to 175,000. If not to invade, then why? I mean, is there recent precedent to suggest that there could be this flexing of a muscle at the border and then the massive retreat?
I think it's the one thing that President Putin decided that he had in his quiver to get the attention of the West and of Joe Biden. They've talked about a lot of the things that Putin wants. They've brought up before, maybe in not quite as much detail, but they've talked about this. But they don't feel that they are getting any attention. So when you put, 100,000 plus on the border, you're going to get some attention. But that said, I think the important thing is, it's sad, of course, that he had to do that. I mean, you would think that he might be able to pick up the phone and start some type of discussion. But it is, I think, very, very important. Number one, it's de-escalated right now. And as was just pointed out, that they keep talking about these things because ultimately, for anyone, for Ukraine, for the United States, for Europe, for Russia, Ukraine's continuing to be caught in that era of conflict and not resolved conflict is very dangerous. So eventually somebody is going to have to resolve it. And there have been, there's the Normandy format, the Minsk agreements, which have not been carried out. They're sitting there uncarried out. And that is the one key, I think, that everybody feels could ultimately solve this. So to put it on the table and to, I think, as Biden said, we're willing to discuss it, but you have to stand down. You cannot take military action, I think is actually probably the best outcome that you could expect. I would note, by the way, we haven't heard anything from the Kremlin. And that to me is significant because usually they're, the jump ball is in their corner. They're usually on it and they have something to say. But so far, they're not really saying too much of anything. And we'll be listening tonight to see what they have to say.
Ambassador, can you build on that? Because when the question was just asked in the press conference there, did President Biden make any concessions to Putin? What would those look like? What can the U.S. offer, as Jill was just sort of outlining there?
So I don't think that President Biden was willing or in fact did make any concessions. I think what the reason we're seeing this troop buildup is because Vladimir Putin wants something that no one wants to give him. He wants to control the future of Ukraine. He has made very clear that he thinks there is a historical and cultural bond between Ukraine and Russia that is quite unique, that in fact Ukraine should not be an independent country, that it should be at least sing to the tune from Moscow or at best be part of the Russian state. And he is putting military forces there in order to force that issue onto the agenda. And I think the goal of President Biden's meeting today with Vladimir Putin was to make very clear that the United States does not accept either that goal of Russia making Ukraine less than anything that it should be, which is a sovereign and independent state, or the means by which Vladimir Putin is trying to achieve them, that is militarily. We are willing to talk about European security, he made clear. We will do that together with all of our allies. We should have a conversation about that. By the way, as Jake Sullivan underscored, that's not something new. In 1974, we had a conference on security and cooperation in Europe that led to the Helsinki Final Act. We've had these kinds of discussions during the Cold War, after the Cold War. It's perfectly fine to do it in the future, but we're not going to do it with 100,000 troops ready to invade on the borders of Ukraine. And that's the message, I think, that President Biden was trying to send to President Putin, and to do so with the full support of our allies in Europe.
All right, we'll see if that message is received. Ambassador Ivo Daalder, Jill Dougherty, Phil Mattingly, Matthew Chance, and Kylie Atwood, thank you all.